Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we are in round number 6 of our coverage of the 2020 Candidates Tournament. We'll go ahead and jump into it. White's going to be played by Nepomniachtchi. He's had a very good tournament. He sits atop of the tournament. We looked at him play a game in game number 5 and ended up winning that. His opponent not having the best tournament. That is Liren. He started out with 2 losses. Then surprisingly came back and won game number 3 against Fabiano Caruana, and a game that no one expected him to win, having the tournament he was having. One of the favorites to win this tournament. He has had 2 draws since then. Comes in and needs a much-needed victory against Jan. Now, luckily for Liren, Jan came into this game and pretty much told everyone was not feeling well, was going to be going for a quick draw. After today, they do have a rest day. So wanted to just get a quick draw, take his lead going into the rest day. But we'll see how that ends up for him. Starts out with e4, e5, and that f3, knight c6, bishop b5. So getting into the Rai Lopez. Yesterday when we looked at this, it was the Berlin defense. But we see a6, bishop back here to a4. So a little bit different line than we're used to seeing. Knight to f6, castle on the king side, and then after bishop to e6, we see d3. This is the modern line, something we don't see all that often, but decides to go ahead and play something a little bit outside the ordinary. I would say this is more of a drawish line, but that seems to be what he is going for. Bishop comes back here to b3, and then after pawn d6, solidifying the pawn chain, plays a3. This is preparing for if the knight were to come here to a5, he can always bring his bishop back here to a2. First decides to castle on the king side, knight to c3, and then an interesting move from black, and that is knight to a5. Now, knight to a5 is the threat that black has on the board, but that's usually just setting up for the pawn to come to a3, and then you don't always see knight to a5 because then bishop comes back here to a2. And this is a move that Bobby Fischer liked to play a lot, getting his bishop out here to c4 and then bringing it back to a2 and just putting constant pressure on his opponent. Once the pawn comes up here to e5 and they solidify with d6, this long light square diagonal is a real threat that white has for the rest of the game. So usually don't see knight to a5 here, but decides, let's go ahead and try that out here. Bishop comes back here to a2 and then bishop to e6. Definitely needs to stop this threat that we have here. Pawn up to b4, attacking the knight. Bishop comes down and takes. Rook recaptures here. Want to make sure you don't take the knight. It could be tempting. Say, yeah, I'll do something cute and take with your pawn here. Bishop comes back. All of a sudden, white has double pawns here on the a file. Black has a pretty good position, has the bishop pair. Definitely not what you want to do. So correctly decides to go ahead and recapture with his rook here on knight to a2. Knight comes back to c6. Work here is done. Bishop to g5. Queen to d7, bishop takes, bishop recaptures, and then knight to d5. Now attacking this bishop. Now, as far as where black can really go to from here, has a few options. Could play bishop comes back to d8. It's no longer under a threat. Can't obviously come to e8 here. Or e7 with the queen, wants to protect the bishop here. Could come back to d8, but then really all this queen is doing is just sitting there protecting the square. But white could just completely avoid that line and go a completely different route and start to push forward with maybe c4 and just say, yeah, don't have your queen involved at all into the game. Another option that you could see is knight to e7. Yes, this could just force the move right here. That is going to be fine, I think, from black's standpoint. He would eventually bring his king over here to h8, then swing his rook to the semi-open file on g8 as well. But just having your opponent hang out here with a nice little outpost on d5 is pretty frustrating. The other move that he has, and that's exactly what he played, is a5. And say, I don't really like any of those moves. I like my setup that I have in the center. I'm going to start pushing on the queen side of the board. Now we see rook swing over to b2. Wants to protect it in a little bit different way than some others might. After the recaptures here, he does have his pawn here on b4. Does not want to have his rook hanging out here on a2 after he decides to recapture like he did. Now the bishop comes back to d8. pawn up to a c4, so starting to break open the center of the board here. Knight to d4, knight recaptures, and then the pawn captures here. All in all, I like white's position. He has a good central control of the center with his pawns. He has a nice little outpost with his knight here on a d5. Yes, both sides are equal in material, but black does have these central pawns, and they are all doubled up. Not exactly how black would like it. Very easy for white to now get his queen involved to the board, have both of his rooks. What black really needs to do is take over the game, open up the center, and then really control it with his bishop. Definitely going to be difficult, but that's what black's going to be looking to do here. Queen to c2, rook over here to e8, just centralizing a little bit. Pawn to g3. Pawn takes, queen recaptures here, and then pawn to c6, forcing the knight to come back. Knight comes back here to f4. Bishop comes down. Says, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and take this knight here. White's not looking to get double pawns on the f-file, so instead decides to bring his knight back here to e2. Also attacking this pawn here on d4. Now, d5 looks a little bit awkward because it says, okay, yeah, I'm attacking your queen, but you can just take my pawn here on d4. This is obviously going to be a trap. That would be a huge mistake for the queen to take here on a d4 because bishop to f6 is devastating. Attacking the queen. Queen can't capture as soon as the queen moves. It can't even get to a safe square to defend this rook. This rook is going to fall here on b2. So it does not do that, obviously. And then we see Jan play pawn takes on d5. After the pawn captures, then the queen comes back here to b3. We'll be able at some point to put some pressure on these central double pawns. But at the time being, decides does not want to worry about that. And so brings his queen back here to b3. Starts to push on the king side of the board. It's very difficult to see how Ding Liren is going to continue and put a lot of pressure, but decides to start with h5 and then b5 over here. So has the passed pawn. Rule number one, if you have a passed pawn, start to push that as much as possible, and that's exactly what he does. h4, b6 here, pawn comes down here to h3, just stopping some of the squares that this king can go to if there's ever an attack on this back rank here. King to h1. Rook over here to b6, trying to stop this pass pawn. Definitely have to make sure that you don't allow your opponent to push any further up the board here. Rook to b1, just trying to put all the material on this b file. This tends to be, or this looks to be the most important file on the board right here. Bishop comes back here to d8, and then queen up here to b5. You can tell why the knight didn't come here to d4. Same reason as before. The bishop could just come here to f6. Not necessarily the setup that white is looking for. So we continue. Queen comes down here to a g4, attacking the knights here on e2. And then queen takes on d5. Now this looks to be a mistake. It's difficult to see exactly the best move. Maybe queen to f5, still holding down this material here on a d5. Not actually sure why he decided to come down here to g4, but Jan went ahead and played queen takes here on d5. Gets that material back. Maybe black said, yeah, I'm just not going to be able to hold on to this material as long as I'd want to anyway. So I'm going to go ahead and bring it here. Doesn't really have a strong attack, though. Can't take the knight here on e2 because the rook is protecting it. Queen comes down here, or the rook comes down here, excuse me, to a5. And this is a trap. This is really a sacrifice. You don't want to take right here on a5 because then the queen can come to f3 check. And there's no way to stop the checkmate here on g2. So needs to make sure that he holds the queen on this long light square diagonal. And so that's why we see the move queen to c6. Then rook swings over here to c5. Same thing, trying to get this queen off this long diagonal. I think Ding Liren's looked at this and says, I'm starting to lose the position here. So I need to just see if I can get white to make a huge mistake here. He does not. Decides to play queen up here to e8. Check. After the king moves, now knight comes down here to g1. This is now protecting the critical square here on f3 that Ding was looking to go to. Rook comes down, captures the pawn here on b6, but that's fine because then the bishop is going to fall here on d8. After the rook falls, rook recaptures, and then rook comes down here to c1. So this is pinning down the knight here. Can no longer take if the queen comes to f3. So white does need to strike an attack here. That's exactly what he does. And queen to h4 pretty much puts the nail in the coffin. This is check. Also forces his opponent to exchange queens. No other way around this. After the queen takes, pawn recaptures here. And after rook to d1, we see f3, and Liren decides to go ahead and resign in this spot. If you're curious why he would respond, because after the rook takes here, then the knight could take this pawn on h3, and this is actually protecting the pawn, because if the rook takes, then the knight can swing up here, check, forking the rook here on f3. So no real way for black to continue. If he tries to push his pawn, maybe rook to c3, his king can start to get involved into the game. Rook down here, c2, can attack the pawn here if he tries to push it. Maybe knight e or g5 check in between move, but then rook to d3. You can see there's no way to defend this pawn, and the king's not going to be able to make its way over here and help as well. So white should be able to just overwhelm his opponent on the king side of the board. So Liren, knowing that Jan is such a good in-game player, decides to go ahead and resign and take it into the rest day. Liren not having the best game, only has 2 points out of the potential 6 in the first 6 rounds. Jan, on the other hand, is looking pretty good. In first place, 4.5 points out of the possible 6, and he goes into the rest day. Hopefully he can feel better after the rest day. While this was an exciting game, and even bigger news in the Candace tournament, and that is Anish Giri, after 20 games in the Candace tournament. Remember, he played an entire Candace tournament in the past, won 0, drew every single one, came into this tournament, drew the first 5 games, because why not? That's what he does. He comes into the 6th game, and he wins his first Candidates game ever. Now, it only took him 7 hours and 98 moves in his game, but he ended up getting a victory. So congratulations to the draw master himself, Anish Giri. Also congratulations to Jan going into the second break here with the lead. Hopefully you guys are enjoying this tournament. We do have 8 more rounds, so a lot of chess left to go. It's anyone's tournament. Jan definitely looks to be the leader in the clubhouse, but in second place is MVL, and those 2 players actually go up head-to-head in round number 7. So definitely we'll be looking forward to that. But again, thanks for watching. I'll see you guys in round number 7 in 2 days.